I do not have a PowerPoint tonight, so you'll have to just look at your Bibles or me or something. I don't know. It's good to see you. Sunday nights right now are harder for me, I think, than they have been in the past. My mom I don't know how many, we had this conversation probably 50 times, where she'd do this thing, and for some reason, whenever something came up and she needed to talk, she would call me at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings and 5 o'clock on Sunday nights. And so eventually I was like, I'm just a little bit busy so you could just bump it up an hour. If you could call it 12 o'clock on Sunday mornings and 6 o'clock at Sunday nights, that would be, that would work a little bit better for me. And she got Sunday mornings, but she never got Sunday nights. She still called me just about every, around 5:30 on every Sunday night, it seemed like. And the last time that I talked to her was the Sunday before she passed. She called, and I stepped out, and she just wanted to talk, and we talked for a good 10 minutes. I'm very glad that I did, but I've had a harder time, I guess, with that since then. So I don't have a ton to say tonight, and I hope you'll bear with me on that. Sean is out of town. Traditionally, Sean does his Q&As on the third Sunday of each month, and so he bumped it back to the second because the gospel meeting is on the third Sunday, so he's not preaching, and then now he's not here, so then I got the question that he was going to do during the question and answer on the third Sunday that's not even the third Sunday. So that's pretty fun. If you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to turn to John 14. The question that he gave me is, if heaven is a place without sin, then why is it described in terms of earthly desires that would be deemed unwanted in God's eyes? Examples would be mansions, gold, treasures, things that would be symbols of a lot of money. You might not know this about me, this is actually something that I'm very interested in and have a lot of thoughts on, so I was more than willing to tackle this. This is in a field, I'm going to give you a $5 word, and it's not nearly as intimidating as it sounds. This is in a group of discussions called eschatology. And all eschatology is your understanding of what happens after death. Your eschatology is your view of heaven and hell and what exactly all of that's going to look like and when it's going to happen and all of that fun stuff. So eschatology is super interesting and really, really important. And every Christian, whether they realize it or not, has an eschatology. They have an understanding of heaven and hell and what life looks like after death. And so we're going to talk a little bit tonight about that and what exactly does that look like and why does the Bible choose the words that it does? Does it choose the words that we think it does? And why does any of that even matter in the first place? If you've been in church for very long or have read through the Bible, you know heaven is described a lot of times not only in very material ways, but described in what we would call opulent ways, right? Because we're not just told that heaven is a nice place or that it is a fun place to go. We're told that it has streets of golds and that all these things are adorned with all of these precious gemstones and that we have mansions and all of these things. And so why is that the case? John 14:1 and 2, which was read for us in our scripture reading, says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would not have told you. I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you." There is the word that's being used there for mansions is monai or monet, which is kind of ironic given the discussion that we're having because it sounds very close to money, but it is not money. It is just, if you're going for a literal translation of that word, it just means dwelling place. Abode would be a very good way to describe it. It's not used very often in the Bible, and so we go actually to different texts and different discourses in Greek to translate it or to define it really. But the idea is very simple. It's very bare bones. It's just a place that you can live. basically. And so different translations handle that vagueness in different ways. You have translations like the King James, New King James, American Standard that will say mansions. The New American Standard just goes with dwelling places. They go with very literal. NIV, ESV, a lot of the more, I guess we'll say contemporary translations use the idea or the word rooms. And so as you can see, there is a wide spectrum of ways that verse, that particular word is handled just from translation to translation. If you're just going for accuracy, then a lot of those contemporary, the NIVs and the ESVs, are probably a lot closer to the idea of what Jesus was saying there when they just use rooms. Traditionally, that word is not translated mansions. Outside of this instance, in this passage in the Bible, it's not translated mansions. And early on in translation work, it was not translated mansions. It's not until the King James comes around that we see that particular textual variant start to pop up. The word mansion, I would argue, is probably a little bit misleading. If you turn over with me to Matthew chapter 6, we'll look at verses 19 through 21. It says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Jesus isn't asking you to store away a bunch of physical things, right? And he doesn't seem to be directing you to a bunch of physical things either. He's telling you to look forward to something that is much more intangible than that, something that is indestructible, something that is eternal. And that's what he's kind of pushing people to do, to lay up treasures, to invest not in physical things, in spiritual things. So why then does he use the language that he does? Well, why do passages in Revelation talk about stone-crusted ground and paths of gold and all of these things? Jesus is a very good teacher, right? And so he understands that he's wrestling with very hard concepts here, and that he's talking to audiences that very regularly misunderstand what he's saying, even when he puts it in the simplest terms. And so what Jesus regularly tries to do in his teaching is take these big theological concepts that they don't understand and then set them side by side with these very real, very physical, very tangible concepts that they do understand. That is what parables are really on their face value, right? It's taking these big things like you have the parable of the sower, right, where he's talking about the contents of your heart and how you respond to the gospel and the effects that it has on different kinds of people. And instead of just coming out and saying all of that, Jesus instead gives you this discussion on farming, because the people he's talking to are not theologians, and they are not people who, generally speaking, other than the Pharisees, have spent a ton of time really wrestling with these ideas, but they are farmers. And they are people who understand those kinds of ideas. And so he takes them and he boils it down. I don't know if you are aware of this or not. The Old Testament does not talk very much, or at least explicitly, about what comes after death. The Old Testament does not have an especially developed eschatology, to use that word we learned together tonight. We understand some things in the Old Testament. It's very common for us to go back and read the Old Testament and read our understanding of the afterlife into it. That was not very common in Jewish culture. They really were very uncertain about what came after all of this. They understood broadly that it involved a reuniting with their Creator, but they didn't really get all of the finer details of that. And so Jesus is dealing with an audience that is very uncertain and has a lot of misgivings about what's going to come after death. And so instead of trying to have this giant discourse on renewed creation versus a total annihilation and what all of that looks like and where it's going to all shake out at the end, he talks about things that they get, like immeasurable wealth and streets paved with gold and mansions, maybe, probably not, but it's possible. And I don't think Jesus is trying to say that heaven is literally going to be streets of gold and all of these things. Instead, he's kind of guiding them to this idea of abundance, right? He's guiding them to this truth that heaven is so much greater than you could possibly imagine. You have in your mind these ideas of opulence, these ideas of grandiose abundance. And he says, take those and then magnify them. Extrapolate that out by a few thousand, and then you begin to maybe touch just the very edge of what heaven is going to be like. The Bible, I sometimes people will say, and I understand what they mean and what they're going for, and I appreciate it. People talk about the Bible being very simple, or the idea that the Bible is a very straightforward book. And that comes, I think, from a very well-meaning place. That's probably not a very fair assessment of the Bible, though. And there are times where it is straightforward, and there are times where Jesus or whoever is speaking is very blunt. But there's also times where the Bible chooses to pull on imagery that has literally been laid out over thousands of years, and from Old to New Testament, layered on top of itself over and over and over again. And so occasionally it's important to sit and pull back and understand that there's layers to a lot of this. I don't know what heaven is going to be like, or how exactly it's all going to function, and what it's all going to look like when that all's said and done. And if you choose to believe that it is literal streets of gold and gemstones in the ground and all of that, I think that's totally fine. So please don't misunderstand me, and I'm not sitting here saying that if you have a different view of that, then you're just completely wrong, and that's a damnable offense. That's not the goal. I'm just simply saying I think maybe Jesus was going for a little bit deeper there. I really enjoy Revelation 22, chapter 4, or 22, verse 4, where it says, they will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. Exodus 33 is this story where Moses says to God, please, he begs God to show him his glory, right? And God basically tells him, no, I can't do that, because if I were to do that and you were to see my glory, then you won't live through it. You wouldn't make it if I were to do that. And that's contrasted with what we see here in these few verses where it says that God's going to look upon every person who's with him in that day, and they're going to be close enough to him that they're going to, it says wear his name on his forehead. That probably means that they're going to look like God, basically, that you're going to be in such close proximity to your Creator that you begin to reflect your Creator. You actually take on some of his personality, some of his characteristics, and show that back to those around you. The opulence of heaven, in my mind and in my understanding, in my eschatology, if you will, is not streets of gold or mansions or things like that. I think it is proximity to the Creator. The Bible is a really cool book. And if you begin to study it and you really dive deep into the literature of it, which I highly recommend, there's a lot of neat things that it does. And one of the things that the Bible does is it rhymes. And what that means is there's these motifs or these themes that appear in one place in the Bible, and they appear again and again and again and again throughout the Bible. And specifically, one thing that the authors of the Bible and God really like to do is they really like to take the beginning of the Bible and rhyme it with the end of the Bible and vice versa. Right? And so one of the big things, one of the big selling points of the Garden of Eden, all the way back in Genesis, is proximity to God. The idea that Adam and Eve walked with their Creator in the midnight sun, or whatever your translation says, not midnight sun, whatever. this proximity to God, this closeness to him, this oneness that was only experienced in the garden. And then, as we so often are prone to do, we as humans mess that up. And that proximity gives way to distance. And we no longer dwell with God, and we no longer are in Eden. And then everything really, if you boil it down to it, everything after that point, in one way or another, in the Bible, can be summed up in getting back to Eden. Getting back to that proximity to God. That's really the whole biblical narrative from that point onward, is just getting back, getting that closeness, getting that oneness, getting that togetherness back with God. And so you see that in Revelation, towards the end, where you see this idea of God setting everything back to how he meant for it to be all along, for him bringing his people together, both from the old law and the new law, and joining them together in heaven with him forever. You see this Edenic image of the way that it was always meant to be. The way that God always intended and hoped and wanted. The kind of relationship that he always desired to have with his people was one of very intimate proximity. So the greatest treasure that heaven has to offer is so much more than a mansion or really cool streets. It is just togetherness with the perfect in love, perfect in knowledge, perfect in kindness and goodness and holiness, togetherness with the Creator of everything, who is divinely and intricately interested in the ongoings of your life, who wants to know everything about you and already does, and is still intimately dedicated to you. I think that is just such a neat story. I've told people lately, I think Tyler Estes and I were having this conversation a few weeks back. There's a lot of different arguments for the existence of God, right? Apologetics is a very diverse field, and you can make a lot of points, a lot of overwhelming points in my mind for the existence of God. One of the things that really, in my mind, tips the scales, and this is a personal thing, it carries a lot of weight for me, is the way that the Bible is written. It is such a masterpiece of literature, written over thousands of years by countless different authors, all kind of like just setting the next guy up to set the next guy up to set the next guy up. In my mind, it's something that we just aren't capable of doing on our own. There's nothing else like it in literature. And one of the neat things, one of the coolest things about the story, in my mind at least, is the way that God is working everything together with the end goal being you. I know that we sing a lot of songs, and there's definitely a place for them. I'm not dunking on these. We sing a lot of songs that talk about how awful we are and how much of a wretch we are and how wicked and terrible we are, and there's a place for that, and there's a scope for that. But I do also think that it's important to remember that once you become a Christian, God doesn't see you that way anymore. And even when you're not a Christian, God still sees you as the most important, the most tantamount thing in his entire creation. And so all he wants, all he's been doing throughout the entirety of history is working and trying and putting all of his divine creative energy into finding ways to show you his love and his goodness. And that becomes tantamount, that becomes totally realized at the end of time. When you hear good, well done, good and faithful servant, and he takes you and he spends the rest of forever with you, whatever that looks like, wherever that happens, I think that's where we want to be. I hope that's where you want to be. And if that's something that you want to be part of, we'd love to talk to you about how you get there. And we'd love to help you along that journey. If there's anything we can do for you as a church family, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?